Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. Here, by popular demand, we have another presentation by Tony Chong, who has decades of experience working in the aerodynamic leading edge of some of the most advanced aircraft technologies to come out of Northrop and Northrop Grumman design team. So ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to introduce Tony Chong.
Well, thank you all for coming out on a very, very wet day. To recap, at the first session, we talked about design philosophy, and again, we're going to look at that. As we mentioned, Northrop would design a product using various technologies, and they would flow those technologies into subsequent designs, a lot of times because it's cheaper than reinventing the wheel, but also because it reflected what they felt was the best solution to the problems. This also goes hand in hand with not just aero design, but propulsion. Propulsion usually lagged behind what the aero designers wanted to do, but propulsion eventually catches up. And as one structures guy told me a long time ago, it's always propulsion's fault, but we will not belabor that here. Part one, we talked about the Northrop tail. Keep looking at that again in this one. On some of the ones, I'll point out evolutions in the Northrop tail. We talked about flying wings. We talked about air-breathing missiles and the supersonic evolution. Part two, we're going to go in further looking at that evolution in the lightweight fighter design, and then we'll go into the advanced tactical fighter, the attack aircraft, VSTOL, which is very important. Most people do not know how much work Northrop put into vertical and short takeoff and landing systems. ISR, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance system space, and then we'll look at some really cool, neat designs. In 1952, November of 1952, Jack Northrop leaves the company. The reason he does so, Jack Northrop leaves. Oliver Eccles, who is his general manager, the man that he courted for a couple of years to become the general manager, they have a clash of wills. Jack Northrop wants to name a successor in the advanced design department to himself. He wants Eugene Root, a guy from former Douglas and Rand Corporation. Eccles, looking at the problems that Northrop was having, decides he wants somebody with more stature. He wants Edgar Schmood. Jack Northrop loses that battle, realizes that he no longer controls even his own department within his company, and so he resigns. The effective date is January 1953. Schmood is then named Vice President of Engineering. He brings in his own team, a lot of people from North American, which is why Northrop became known as South American for a while, because all of the engineers moved south. But he also brings in a couple of other folks. Now, according to Northrop lore, Edgar Schmood was the one that created the N-102 Fang. The Fang was revolutionary in the sense that it was a lightweight fighter, small, maneuverable. This was a single-engine design. And from the Fang came the F-5 T-38 series. Well, we're going to explore that a bit. The story actually begins earlier, begins in the December 1951 when Kelly Johnson from Lockheed and Lee Atwood from North American Aviation take a fact-finding trip to Korea during the height of the Korean War, go to various Air Force bases, talk to the pilots there, and see what the pilots want in a fighter. By this time, they were facing the MiG-15, which totally surprised everyone at how good the airplane was. It wasn't until they started getting the leading-edge slats on the F-86F that the Sabres were superior to the MiGs, but at that time they were pretty much head-to-head. What they took away from that fact-finding tour was the pilots wanted an airplane that was fast, high-flying, very maneuverable, and easy to maintain. So they go home, and from that, Kelly Johnson devises the XF-104 Starfighter. But the story filters out to the rest of the industry because that's what they were there for, is to talk to the industry. Jack Northrop's team was one of the ones that found out about this desire for a small lightweight fighter, so they began designing such a fighter early in 1952. Note the upper left design. You note the old Boojum style wing that we talked about last time. There it is again on a design that harkens to what the Fang would become. Even more direct is the PD 1713, the one on the lower right. That has very much more the ultimate Fang configuration. These were done before Jack Northrop retired. When Edgar Schmood comes in, he's still very aware. By this time, the Air Force has released a Gore for a lightweight fighter. Lockheed, of course, is in the front running for this. So he goes to Lee Began and says, I want you to take this lightweight fighter, put butterfly tails on it, and we'll call it the new N-102. So he does that. It's a clipped wing Delta with the butterfly tail, as you can see. This was unveiled in January 1953, January 10th. In March 1953, Lockheed is awarded the XF-104 contract. Northrop, however, is undeterred. For some reason, they persist and they continue development of the N-102. Obviously, they were looking at foreign sales at this point, so they come up with this very elegant design in July of 1953. By this time, William Ballhaus Sr., who has come over from Convair Division, is now chief engineer, and Welko Gasich is now chief of preliminary design. Now, Ballhaus, obviously with Convair, had a lot of insight into their Delta wing proposals. So all of a sudden, you're seeing a pure Delta wing appear on the Fang. Now, the earlier N-102 was a clipped Delta. This is a pure Delta here. So nothing comes of the Fang. But in 1954, Ed Wall of the General Electric Lynn Division in Massachusetts comes and visits Ballhaus with a model of a new jet engine. And he brings it in a suitcase. This engine is about 3 feet long, and he unveils it, and he says, oh, what size model is that? And he says, this is full size. It's a small, full-size engine that would weigh 500 pounds. And Ballhaus goes, can you put an afterburner on this thing? And he says, sure we can. Sure we can. So they said, aha. Now, GE was originally looking to power the radioplane XQ-4A with this engine. But Ballhaus saw the immediate application to the small lightweight fighter. In fact, it was light enough and small enough with enough power that he felt that they could achieve what they wanted to with those small engines. Now, there was also another jet engine company that was producing a small engine like the J-85, which the GE engine eventually became known as. It was Fairchild with the J-83. But as far as it turned out, GE had the inside edge, and they eventually designed the J-85, and it fulfilled its potential. So they go back, and by this time, they get a word from their sources in Washington that the Navy is looking for a Jeep carrier fighter. Now, the Jeep carriers were your escort-class carriers used to protect the convoys. They were very valuable in World War II and in the First World War, and they felt that if a shooting war started in Europe, they would need escort carriers to protect the convoys against attack from the Soviet Union and their allies. They needed an aircraft that could meet modern-day aircraft on a fairly even level, so they put out a request for a fighter, a carrier fighter, and so this was the first iteration from Northrop. This is in March of 1955. Now, bear that in mind, March of 1955. It's a fairly straightforward design. As you saw from the long-range interceptors, by this time, Northrop and Schmood was particularly enamored with podded engines under the wing. Part of the reason for this was ease of access. You could swap out the engines without a whole lot of structural changes to the fuselage if they were embedded. Obviously there were penalties. If you had an engine out situation on takeoff or landing, it could be very bad. But they were looking at this idea. They also came up with a two-seat version because at about the same time, the Air Force released their Gore 94, which is general operations requirement for a two-seat supersonic trainer. So that was the first design. It was also called the tally-ho design, after George Talley, who was one of the designers that drew it up. Walko Gasich and his team felt that the tally-ho design would not achieve its performance goals. They felt that it would not go supersonic because of the engine specifications. It was right at the edge of the transonic, supersonic boundary, and that the design would not go supersonic. So they proposed embedding the engines into the fuselage and going with a T-tail design. And there was this fierce debate within the company. So fierce and so heated that at times Gasich thought he was going to get fired. But eventually, Schmood relents, and they go with what became the N156. The N156, the top left view, that was the standard Navy Jeep carrier proposal. There was a similar proposal, a two-seat version for the Air Force for their Gore. Same general configuration, the T-tail, the whole 9 yards. The lower right one was a rocket-assisted jet fighter based on the N156. It was a reaction motors TR-132 turbojet. It could take the aircraft to Mach 2 at 35,000, 50,000, and 78,500 feet. Well, unfortunately, the Navy decides to do away with the Jeep carriers. So based on that, the Northrop board authorizes Gasich to pursue the Air Force trainer. By this time, they had realized, due to studies with other Century Series fighters, that the T-tail had serious pitch-up problems. So they said, well, okay, we'll extend the fuselage, drop the horizontals from the top of the tail down to the fuselage, and they came up with, essentially, became the N156 design. Now, if you look on the N170 design on the lower right, that had the original tail configuration. The vertical tail was highly swept. They decided that they had too many problems with that, and so they went with a much larger swept vertical. This essentially was the design that won, and this was presented in March of 1956. So in 1 year, you had two major design changes and one minor change in the vertical within a span of 1 year. So that tells you how fast the technology was evolving, but it also shows you how the Northrop design influences were remaining consistent where they could, but changing where they had to. By the way, this design became the basis of the mock-up, and the mock-up was completed in August of '56. The contract was awarded in July of '56. There was a formal mock-up review in October of '56. Between August and October was when the time when General Irvin paid a visit to Northrop, and there was that famous legend, the Northrop wink. That's when Irvin comes in, looks at the airplane, the mock-up, and says, now that's a Schmood design if ever I saw one. Of course, it wasn't a Schmood design, it was Gasich. Schmood and Gasich are standing behind Irvin, and Gasich sort of looks over at Schmood, and Schmood gives him a wink. Like, you're right, it worked, but it's my design. The only minor change to the basic N156T, which was the trainer version, was they changed the tail to a trapezoidal tail, and that essentially is the design that has stayed consistent since 1958. The first flight was in '59, and it's still flying with the same basic configuration. So it was an incredible, incredible piece of design and a true hot rod for the Air Force. Set several records, altitude, time to climb. Jackie Cochran set 8 female pilot records in the airplane. It was a true hot rod, and it was a trainer. This is the #1 airplane. Note that there's a shroud over the rear canopy for instrumentation. Obviously, that's where the instructor pilot would sit. Its sister program, the N156F, had a tougher time getting into production. The Air Force, while it wanted a small, light, supersonic trainer, didn't care a fig for having a small, lightweight fighter. And so Northrop was left trying to sell it to NATO. The first fighter deal of the century boiled down to a Lockheed win with the F-104. The Northrop then put the airplanes, the N156Fs, into mothball. And then in 1961, June and July, the Army said, we want a fast-forward air controller aircraft. We want it rough-field, and we think the competition to do this, we want the N156F to participate. Also participating was the Fiat GR, or the G91R, and also a modified Douglas Skyhawk. The original designation was the A4D-2N, but later changed to A4C. So all three of these airplanes are doing sod landings and takeoffs. They put special tires on the N156F. They put it in Army markings for some of the PR shots. Pretty color shot there with the orange on the airplane. And then the Air Force said, no, wait a minute, you're impinging on our roles and missions here. Fixed wing combat aircraft, that's our job. You guys back off. And so they did. So it wasn't until a year later that the State Department chose the N156F as the Military Assistance Program aircraft of choice, which meant that any foreign allied nation who wanted a small lightweight fighter, they would get help in purchasing this airplane. And so that set Northrop on the road to the lightweight fighter. Well, not being satisfied, of course, you have a program that has sold, you want to capitalize on it. They did. All these proposals sprang out of the basic N156F design, and you can see some of them there. Basic trainers, combat trainers, Navy trainers, Army surveillance aircraft. This is, again, around the time that the Army was still having their competition, so Northrop was going, what can we do with this airplane to fulfill the Army if and when we win the program? Also, VTOL test beds. So let's take a closer look at some of the more interesting designs. The N156 liaison aircraft, a fast transport for VIPs, sort of the Learjet of the proposal for the 1960s. NATO forces highly concerned with loss of runways, so they wanted zero launch aircraft, so N156F on a launch track there, zero launch track. The most intriguing one had to be this one, the N205 spaceplane trainer, also known as the ST-38. A large part of it was common with the T-38, but the initial configuration was to be vertically launched, then to go up to altitude, and then come down, coast down and land. They eventually went with the N205B proposal, horizontal takeoff and landings using 3 Rocketdyne AR4 10,000-pound thrust each rocket motors. You could light them all at once or individually. And it would take you to Mach 3.3 at 90,000 feet when the motors cut out, and then you would coast to 285,000 feet. It was an astronaut trainer. They were looking for a space plane. And this was proposed before, at least the N205A, was proposed before the T-38 had even flown. So they were really thinking ahead. They didn't win the contract, but they were thinking ahead. Getting back to the Army surveillance aircraft, again, you can see attaching reconnaissance noses to the basic N156 design. They went ahead and decided to upgrade it. They got a bigger wing with an additional set of pylons for the N156D for the close air support. They were looking at close air support because that was a rising concern in the early 60s. Navy trainers, gotta train the guys to land on the boat. And you can see in that lower right illustration the commonality that they were looking for between the T-38 and the N156. So they were doing a lot of plug and play options there. So they eventually devolve into further N designations. The N285, the initial T-38N proposal did not go down well with the Navy. The landing gear was too spindly, among other things. It also had a higher wind over deck factor than most other aircraft that they were looking at, so they had to address both of those issues. So the N285 was one of those attempts to address that. Notice the beefier landing gear, the extended nose strut so you get more wing lift. The white outline on the plan view there, that's the T-38. That shows you how much bigger the N285 was versus the standard T-38, at least the wing and horizontals. That was also to bring the landing speed down for the when it come on the carrier. Following into the close air support idea, Northrop entered close air support competitions with various designs based on the N156. This is N286. You can see that they're getting into short takeoff configurations. Again, looking at rough fields and small runways in highly contested environments. Remember, again, also Vietnam is going on at this time. So they're looking at how to address those problems. You can see the high lift devices on the leading and trailing edges of the wings, and also the increase in the span. N290, more short takeoff and landing capabilities. They're also looking at higher rated engines. This particular one was looking at a GE1 or a J1A1 with 7,500 pounds of thrust. A pair of those would really boost the power of the airplane. Another iteration, adding plugs to the fuselage to lengthen it. And you can see that this is a march toward what would eventually become the F5E. They're extending the fuselage, they're increasing the wing so they could get better performance than they could with that small F5A, which was essentially a point interceptor and a short-range close air support aircraft. So these are the N299s. The bottom design had a 60-inch fuselage plug, and you can see where it's plugged into just after the canopy break. Well, that leads to the N300, and this is where the lightweight fighter systems of Northrop start to diverge into three separate programs. The first one starts off with the N300. They're looking for a multi-role fighter now. They're looking at down the road, the F5As and the F104s are being phased out of NATO or getting ready to be phased out. So they said, we need to come up with a replacement for that. We want something that's high performance and multi-role. So the N300 starts off as essentially an enlarged F5 and morphs into the P530 series, which is the Cobra. And you can see that it's still the twin engine, but it's now getting this large leading edge extension, the Cobra hood, as it was called. And the P534, which you see there on the lower right, that was a January 1971 proposal. This was, of course, coming up to that big changeover and getting close to what would become a very important program for the Air Force, one that was unexpected for the Air Force in some ways, but it was led by Major John Boyd, who was a fierce proponent of the concept called energy maneuverability and the lightweight fighter. In fact, he was the founding father of what became known as the fighter mafia. Their whole viewpoint was that these airplanes, to win a dogfight, had to be of this particular configuration or these particular characteristics. And so Northrop spent a lot of time exploring those characteristics for a lightweight fighter market. You can see here the N314 on the upper left and the N315 on the lower right. And the N314 is twin engine and the N315 is a single engine design using the same principles. This eventually leads to the N321, which becomes the P600, and that is Northrop's entry into the Air Force's lightweight fighter competition. This was something that was pushed by John Boyd. They finally decided, okay, we need to look at a lightweight, low cost, big emphasis there, low cost, highly maneuverable day fighter to complement the big expensive F-15. Because we can't afford to buy enough F-15s to do what we want, so we need to complement it. Well, they got into a competition with General Dynamics. In actual fact, in the competition, the number 1 and 2 winners were General Dynamics and Boeing. Northrop was the third winner or the third ranked competitor in that design. But because General Dynamics and the Boeing designs were so similar, the Air Force said, we need something different to show that we're on the right track. So that's why the YF-17 ended up winning that follow-on competition to enter the lightweight fighter, which eventually became the ACF competition. So they were fighting that, and Northrop is still looking at a single engine design. You can see the N322 there on the lower right. That is still pushing a single engine design. And it probably would have been the one to go into it, except that Northrop was looking further down the road. They're saying, okay, if we win the Air Force competition, then what about NATO? We think NATO will want a twin engine airplane with more capability, a multi-role capability, so let's try to do both in one. Let's go with the twin engine design. So they never even submitted the P610. Now, the Navy at this point was looking to replace their light attack aircraft. And Congress said, we want you to look at the winner of the Air Force ACF and if you can, pick the winner for your new VFAX. And the Navy grudgingly said, okay, we'll look at it. Well, what happened? First off, there was a teaming arrangement. Northrop, because we had no Navy experience, needed a Navy partner if we were going to compete in a Navy program. So we teamed with McDonnell Douglas. General Dynamics teamed with Vought. So if we had won the Air Force, it actually was supposed to be winner take all, we would be the prime on the Air Force side, McDonnell Douglas would be the prime on the Navy side. Well, what happened? Air Force picks F-16. Navy says, we don't want a single engine airplane. We want a twin engine airplane. We'll go with the YF-17. So a Northrop design became a McDonnell Douglas prime contract. That's how that happened. Northrop was supposed to build the F-18L, which was the land-based variant. Didn't have the navalized landing gear, didn't have some of the other things that they needed to do, the beefing up of the structure for the carrier design. But we never sold any because McDonnell Douglas started selling F-18s to everybody under the sun who would buy one, and so we got shut out of that market. The irony is that, yes, it was a Northrop design. We didn't win it, sadly, but if we hadn't gone with the YF-17, in all likelihood, we would not have won anything at all. So that's the silver lining to that story of how we did not get to be prime on that program. Well, let's go back to the F-5 series. Remember I said it's split into 3 separate directions. This is the second direction. You have the people going off doing the Cobra, the P530, and then eventually the P600 series. There are still people looking at how to improve the F-5 because now we've got a new program coming up, International Fighter Competition, to sell, again, replace F-5As with something better that could match the MiG-21. So Northrop decides to upgrade the F-5 and put a new J85-21 engine into the airplane. And so the N311 is the first F-5 series airplane, 2-seat, to have the new GE engine. So it's called the YF5-21 for the GE-21 engine. This proves successful, and so they win the contract to build F-5Es and Fs. That sustains the company through the 1970s. First flight of the E was in August 72. First flight of the F was in September 74. So they're going along through the 70s, and they realize we need to upgrade the F-5 again. 1977, President Carter's arms export restrictions led the Pentagon to encourage Northrop to improve the F-5. So it wasn't done just on Northrop's initiative. They were encouraged to do so by the Pentagon. So they started looking at several developments. One was the F-5S, which is the upper left. You can see that it's inherited the YF-17 P530 Cobra hood, still a twin engine, and then they come up with a single engine design using a very powerful F404 engine from GE, and that becomes the F5G. Carter decides that the F5G is too advanced for Taiwan, which was our projected launch customer, but he changes his mind after December 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and then all bets were off. So Northrop decides on its own nickel, because that was one of the conditions by the Carter administration, is that the contractors had to develop the airplane on their own dime, and Northrop took the challenge. And so they come up with the F-5G, which then has a monkey wrench thrown into it by the Reagan administration, which signs a memorandum of understanding with the People's Republic of China, Communist China, in 1982 that said we would not sell advanced fighter equipment to Taiwan, and that included the F-5G. So Tom Jones is left with this magnificent airplane and deciding, what do we do with it now? And his decision was, we are going to go head-to-head with the F-16. So they start doing improvements to the airplane, and they get a new designation for it to show that it's not just an F-5, it is now the brand new F-20. And so there's a picture here of all 3 F-20s that were built and flown. Unfortunately, as we all know, 2 of them crashed, primarily due to G-lock, which is the loss of consciousness due to excessive G's on the pilot. Very sad, but that combined with the fact that the F-16 had tremendous backing from the Air Force, because the more F-16s you sell to foreign countries, the lower the unit price is for the Air Force. And oh, by the way, we don't want to start up an extra logistics trail just for the F-20. So the F-20 doesn't go very far. But it went far enough for Northrop to explore various ways to improve the design. And there you can see larger wing, more powerful engines, kept the same basic configuration, but would have been a very, very impressive lightweight fighter. The third branch of this lightweight fighter story comes down to another export, and this would become known as the P-700. Now, this started off as a bigger airplane than it eventually wound up being, as you can see by the N-310 there. It was actually bigger than the P-530 at that point, but then it wound up being somewhat smaller and became known as the ND-102, because at one point Northrop was going to team with Dornier in Germany to produce a fighter for the German Air Force and hopefully for the rest of NATO. Now, this was at a period when all sorts of European nations were looking to recapitalize their fighter forces, and so you had the British with the EAP, the French with the ACX, the Germans with 2 separate fighter designs, the JG-90 and the ND-102, and plus lots of other things bubbling under the surface. That eventually led to 2 designs, the Rafale, which France went on its own, and then the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is where the 4 other countries, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, and Spain, made a consortium to get their fighter. But before they decided that, this was where the direction that Northrop was trying to sell them fighters for that design. By 1985, this whole idea of a lightweight fighter had a lot of commonality for different roles. Affordability, this was becoming a major driver for aircraft programs in the 1980s, and multi-role. Again, another major driver in aircraft procurement design was the idea that we had to have one airframe do more than one job. We can't afford to buy so many separate airplanes to do individual positions or individual roles. So the compact efficient fighter comes up with 3 basic configurations, and you can see that they've moved away from the basic Northrop fighter configuration and have gone back to a clip delta reminiscent of the Fang. Again, lightweight, but you can see the 3 different configurations there. Air to ground and also multi-role, which was again the emphasis they wanted. There was also an air-to-air variant. Notice also some of the designs have crank deltas and the 2D vectoring nozzles. Again, another big technology push in the early 80s. That bled over into some of the other programs that Northrop did. They were looking at a new trainer proposal. So you got essentially a clip delta semi-tailless for the T-38X, which didn't go anywhere. You also had the N-386, various designs for that. Again, you can see that they're going towards these various clip delta type or trapezoidal type wings, very reminiscent of some of the stuff that was done with the ND-102. The ultimate Northrop pure, and I want to say pure in the sense that it was didn't involve VSTOL as it would later, but the MRF, or the multi-role fighter design, which incorporated a lot of the technologies from the ATF, got rolled into this design. This was the essentially last pure non-STOVL design that Northrop would do for a lightweight fighter. So that was the ultimate design there. Well, having said that, let's take a look at advanced tactical fighter, because a lot of these designs run parallel to the lightweight fighter and the STOVL designs. So you're going to see a lot of the same design configurations. And once again, we start off with the N-300. Now, the original ATF was not an air superiority fighter. It was meant to be a deep interdiction strike aircraft. It was to replace the F-4, the F-105, and the F-111. What other design element that gets pushed during this time is supercruise. This became very important. The ability to sustain supersonic flight without using afterburner. Increases your range, cuts down your gas consumption, all this, it makes you very fast and hard to intercept. So all of these basically air-to-ground advanced tactical fighter concepts incorporate supercruise to some degree or another. And the ideal flight regime for supercruise was pegged at around Mach 1.8. So they were looking at 1.8 for a very long time, because these are all studies that started in the 1970s. And you can see how some of the designs become similar. Again, the clipped delta wing. One of them, you can see that it's got the inlets on the top. Northrop was looking at a dorsal inlet system for a very long time. And of course, the leading edge extensions on a couple of the aircraft. Well, by the late 70s, it becomes very clear that the Soviet Union is working on some very advanced fighters. They would become the MiG-29 and the Sukhoi 27. Very, very good fighters, and it scared the boo out of us because they had look-down, shoot-down capability, and they could track low-flying targets from altitude, which meant that all of our tactics previous to that had to undergo revision in order to combat the Soviet capability. It was also decided to look more into an air-to-air component on the ATF. And so you start to see where they're giving equal emphasis to both air-to-air and air-to-ground. But Northrop was already looking at a pure air-to-air system, which was the P-800, which is the upper left system. Again, it's almost a delta, a clipped delta. It's not quite a straight trailing edge. It's a semi-tailless design. Semi-tailless will show up a lot in these configurations. But they're also looking at agile fighter, this interesting agile fighter concept on the lower right. That was the white world take on low observables. And as we've come to find out, white world understanding of LO is far different from LO, which we will see. This particular, the N-343, the lower right, could carry 10 AMRAAM missiles, including 2 on top of the fuselage or the engine nacelles. About this time, a fellow by the name of Bud Nelson comes over to Northrop from Boeing, brings over some of his ideas, including the parasite fighter concept that Boeing was working on. So he incorporates that basic plan form into a whole slew of his designs for Northrop, one of which becomes one of the early RFI entries for Northrop, this request for information from the Air Force for an advanced tactical fighter. As you can see, it's one of the designs there. The various configurations shown on the lower right, the 356, 357, and 355. Those are all pushed by Northrop as possible entries into the ATF. Now, they were air-to-ground configuration. We didn't go pure air-to-air until later. And all of these designs were smaller, except by one, of all the other entries put in. And Lockheed put in a huge airplane, larger than the SR-71. So we were still pushing this lightweight fighter design. That began to change in early 1982 when the white world, with the heavy influence by Boyd's energy maneuverability ideas and by Everest Riccione, who was working at Northrop and who was basically a Boyd adherent or disciple, if you want to put it that way. He was the one, I believe, that coined the term fighter mafia. This was the basic air superiority fighter that Riccione felt was ideal. Again, semi-tailless, clipped delta. It was a big fighter for Northrop at the time. It was 60 feet long and Mach 2 speeds, Mach 2 plus. So this was the baseline heavy advanced fighter that Northrop was going to look at in the white world. The N-360 would soon get absorbed by the black world, but before it does, or while it does, white world comes up with 2 other designs. An optimized N-364, optimized for supercruise. And then you also have the N-371, which included a canard. I'm sure the French and the British looked at that design as well. Funny thing, a lot of their airplanes came up with the canard configuration. Somebody once told me that there was a fellow that said that he always liked to see a canard on somebody else's airplane. ATF Black World. This is where it gets really interesting. Low observable studies began in 1980 in Northrop to see if advanced low observables could be incorporated into an air superiority fighter. Now, this was not really thought possible because, an advanced fighter, you have all the afterburner, you have the maneuverability, you have all of these attributes that an advanced fighter has to have to achieve air superiority, but now you want to make it low observable. So they said, okay, well, we'll try it out. So they came up with three basic configurations. You had the AMF, which was the Agile Maneuverable Fighter. You also had the Ultra Stealth Fighter, which was also known as the Christmas Tree. And then you had the High Stealth Fighter. Now, Ultra Stealth was sort of said, okay, guys, we want to see if you can do a 4-spike LO airplane as a fighter. And so that's where the Christmas Tree came from. It wasn't a really serious push for a proposal, but it was something that was said, can we do it? Well, yeah, you could design it, but it did terrible in the tunnel. One of the guys that worked on it told me that it had a tendency to want to swap ends, which is not really good for a fighter. So the high stealth fighter was the decision or the design of choice that they wanted to do. The problem was that the AMF kept beating it in all of the fighter parameters. So the job was to make HSF as good as the AMF, and they eventually did. By 1985, the Air Force decides it wants an air superiority fighter, so the ATF proposal, the request for proposal is released, and the HSF becomes Northrop's configuration of choice, which of course becomes the YF-23. Still to me one of the most beautiful airplanes ever designed, and I really wish we had won it, but there you go. What's interesting to me is how very little the basic design changed. You can see the various iterations there. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice a lot of changes in the inlets and the tail spikes and all that sort of stuff, but those were primarily refinements. The basic configuration was there. First flight with the first prototype air vehicle, or PAV-1, with the Pratt & Whitney YF-119 engines took place on 27 August 1990, day before my birthday, which is why I remember it. PAV-2 with the GE F-120s a couple of months later. There was also a Navy ATF component that most people don't realize. So you take this Air Force Advanced Tactical Fighter, and now you have to navalize it, which raises a whole bunch of other problems. And you can see the way they addressed that, because they originally tried a configuration similar to the YF-23, didn't work too well. They tried moving the clipped diamond wing further aft, so you had still the twin tails, but the diamond wing was like the DP-527 that you see there. That didn't work so well, and then so eventually the DP-527 became the preferred configuration. You can see with the canards there. We don't know how serious the Navy really was because they had a lot of other problems, primarily with the A-12, the end of the Cold War, budget costs were being restricted, and so the Navy dropped out of the program. But note the design on the DP-527 because it shows up again. Now, I remember the last time that we did our talk, we talked about the Navy ATA with the pure wing and with the Arrowhead, which was the stealth-driven design, and then the well-balanced design. Well, the NATF design became the performance-driven configuration, which meant that it could fly over Mach 1, where the others two could not. It also had less stealth, but it had more performance in other areas. But it's essentially the same configuration as the NATF-23 of the DP-527 configuration. That also shows up on later iterations of the Advanced Strike Fighter and the JAA, or the Joint Attack Fighter, or the Joint Attack Aircraft. Those names were interchangeable. This would eventually give way to the JAST and the JSF, but these were the last of the heavy multi-role Northrop fighters. So let's take a look real quickly at attack. Remember I talked about the Northrop tail evolution? Well, notice the tail on the next few designs. N308 early concept for close air support. The Air Force finally getting off the dime and having competitions to fill that role. McNamara, the Defense Secretary McNamara, had essentially told the Air Force to fly A-7s as close air support in the interim, so they had another blankety-blank Navy airframe to take care of, as I was told by one person. So you're flying F-4s and A-7s, Navy airframes. The Air Force has to look for its own design because, of course, it has to be invented here, you know. So they start looking at early stuff. One of the primary design choices was turboprop. And so Northrop put a lot of time and energy into turboprop configurations. You can see some of the designs here. Although there's a turbofan on the far right, that configuration is just too weird not to put in here. Well, the turboprop design evolves into a white-tailed pusher aircraft, and of course Sierra Sioux is sitting over in the hangar or hanging up in the hangar over there. It was originally designed as a racer by Walt Fellers, one of Northrop's engineers. It gets pressed into service as a proof of concept aircraft for the Northrop AX proposal. And this AX, again, was a white-tailed pusher design. Congress, however, said, well, turboprops, that's not exactly high-tech, isn't it? Why don't you have a turbofan as your airplane, power your airplane instead of this old technology? So all of a sudden, turbofan-powered designs became the design of choice. So that's why the 308 got bypassed, and so they went to the 312, and eventually the 312 led to the N320 or the A9. Again, note the tail, that big angular tail. You'll see that a little bit later on. Before we do, though, let's talk about VSTOL. Northrop had such a long history in VSTOL aircraft that people don't realize how many designs they looked at and why it was so critical leading to the JSF and why we were even involved with it. Back in the early days, in the 1940s, the N63 was, 1950s, this was a response to the Navy's OS-122 operational specification. They were looking for convoy fighters. These were fighters that could essentially be based on transports and cargo ships, so you wouldn't have to assign a jeep carrier to protect the convoys. And these airplanes would be take off and land on their own power from the deck of a merchantman. And so it was a tail sitter. Several designs were looked at. Lockheed and Convair won the down select to build prototypes. Neither one of them worked very well, although Convair's did actually fly in transition from horizontal to vertical to horizontal flight. So at least that part worked, but it was just realized it was just too difficult to have a pilot sitting on his back try to land an airplane on a pitching, rolling, heaving ship. So the sense finally prevailed. But Northrop didn't just stop there. As you can see, they were looking at a lot of different other designs, a lot of them based on the N156. The N251 used a device called a cascade nozzle, which is essentially a louvered back end, a louvered exhaust that would deflect your exhaust downward. And it was essentially like a Venetian blind. So you rotate these louvers down, your exhaust gets deflected, and that's how you achieve your vertical lift. Fan and wing was another concept they looked at. The N267, the XV5 from Ryan, actually won that particular project to build it for GE. It worked, but again, didn't work well enough for them to pursue it. Northrop, unknown to a lot of people, was the original license builder for the P1127 Harrier, or the Kestrel, I should say, pre-Harrier. The Kestrel was supposed to be built by us for the U.S. military. That picture there is from the model shop. The model shop did several Harriers in U.S. Army markings, or excuse me, several Kestrels in U.S. Army markings, and it was under the N287 project. Unfortunately, it didn't go forward because the Army was told you cannot have fixed-wing aircraft, and the 1965 final accord between the Air Force and the Army killed any Army fighter, even a VSTOL one. So that's why that didn't come to pass. We let the license lapse. McDonnell Douglas picked it up and designed the Harrier. So that's how they got it. Northrop was also looking at the lift plus lift cruise concept. And you can see the ground effects test vehicle is a person standing at the bottom edge of the frame to give you an idea of how big that test article was. And that was done up at Ames. They were proposing either an F-5B or a T-38 baseline for the proof of concept. They were also looking at Continental aircraft engines or GE engines. The Continental IJ-74 proposal would use 3 engines to show you how much more powerful it was to the J-85J4. They would have used 4 to 6 engines to accomplish the same thing. And you can see that's an awful lot of engines to stack up behind the airplane. Where do you put the gas? Advanced VSTOL ideas. This has always intrigued me because I've seen these photos at Northrop and it took me a while to figure out what was going on here. TRACOM stands for Transportation Research and Engineering Command. It's an Army unit looking at advanced designs, and they were looking at a supersonic VSTOL aircraft in the early 60s, and that's the top one. You can see that it appears to be a lift plus lift cruise. The big engines in the center are lift engines. The Air Force was looking at supersonic VSTOL. The cascade nozzle is apparent on the lower left airplane there, and then lift plus lift cruise on the right. Very advanced looking concepts that didn't go anywhere because the Air Force ultimately had too many other things, especially with the Vietnam War going on, to worry about VSTOL. That didn't stop NASA from pursuing VSTOL for research, and so the N309 was a Northrop proposal to modify North American T-39s for research. And you can see the N309 on top is heavily modified. The AD-4421 is a very heavily modified. It's essentially a brand new airplane. But you can see that the different categories of basically taking a straight T-39, modifying it, or modifying it sorta, or modifying it very heavily, these were all the ideas that NASA Langley, not NASA Ames, was pursuing. Like most of the individual sites, the NASA sites have a lot of rivalry, and Langley said, well, we don't want Ames to get all of the VSTOL research funding, we'll propose our own. Well, this eventually leads to NASA Ames studies for Navy Sea Control aircraft. And again, harking back to the convoy fighters, this is a similar idea. HATOL, which is horizontal attitude takeoff and landing, and VATOL, vertical attitude takeoff and landing. And you can see by the illustration on the lower right, look at the carrier behind them. You can see the platform elevates up. The jet was supposed to, hover on its tail, go up and hook up to that platform and then get lowered. Interesting concept, didn't go very far. The 3848, 2D thrust vector nozzling. That was a very big thing in the early 80s because the huge concern was the Soviet Union and its allies taking out our runways at NATO, and where would our planes take off and land from? So if you can shorten the amount of runway you need, you can use sections of the Autobahn. The Saab did a lot of their airplanes to use 500 meters of roadway in Sweden to use for their airplanes. So this is a similar idea. So thrust vectoring was one idea. There's another proposal called Transverse Thrust Lift Augmentation System, developed by Heinz Gerhardt. This is where exhaust gases are blown across the trailing edge control surfaces, just blown span-wise. And this creates additional lift because it creates a barrier for the air not to fall off the trailing edge, so it extends your trailing edge by just blowing exhaust across it. And that would allow you to do shorter landings and shorter takeoffs. Note that on the lower left version, it looks very similar to the Agile fighter. So they were reusing a lot of their design philosophy for these prototype aircraft. Another interesting thing, the lower right drawing, note the stacked engines, very similar to the English Electric Lightning. So this eventually evolves into the N369 and the N382, essentially the son of HATOL. Again, the whole idea is starting to come around to where we want affordable, common airframes that do VSTOL. That is becoming the mantra, and it becomes the holy grail for fighter design teams in the early 90s, or the late 80s, early 90s. So you're looking at these designs here. Canards are coming into play on this for added control, but you can see where they are headed with this. And then they start looking at some other designs. Remember I talked about the multi-role fighter being the last of the non-STOL designs. Well, they start incorporating some of the MRF-53 configuration into STOL designs. And they're using interesting technology. If you note both the plan forms, the looking down on it, you'll see that they are having alongside edge wing configuration with AUX, or outboard control surfaces, using either RALs, which is remote augmented lift system, which means you drive your exhaust through your nose and there's a little small motor in front to help boost the exhaust, or remote exhaust system, which basically redirects the exhaust to a different area. So we're looking at all these different ideas to achieve lift with just the main engine. This ultimately leads to common affordable lightweight fighter, and you can see it's starting to look an awful lot like the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighter, or the Joint Attack Strike Technology aircraft. Northrop's ultimate design for this is called the Affordable Lightweight Fighter, which is the lower right, and the preferred design is the Tri-Surface Common 3A. And right after this becomes Northrop Grumman, and Northrop Grumman decides to team with McDonnell Douglas on McDonnell's design for their JAS, and that ends Northrop's development there. A nice handy bookend. So you can see that there was quite a lot of development by Northrop on STOL designs, and that the road to JSF was a very, very long road indeed. Northrop also has a long history with ISR. Again, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. The XF-15 Reporter, a reconnaissance version of the P-61 Black Widow. It survived the end of World War II and continued production, but only for about a year until the Air Force cut it off because advances in technology in post-war terms were very rapid. Bear in mind also that the 50 airplane contract that Northrop won for the Flying Wing was for the RB-49, the reconnaissance version. They also looked at making an RF-89 by putting a photographer in the nose of a Scorpion. And you can see that drawing there, and that would have been a heck of a ride. But Northrop didn't stop there. The N-165 was part of the Weapons System 118P project, also known as HARP, or High Altitude Reconnaissance Platform, Phase 2. Now, this was a big airplane, 6 Westinghouse engines. It could fly at 77,500 feet. Now that's the upper left. This was developed about the same time as the X-16 by Martin. Unbeknownst to all the contractors and almost everybody in the Air Force, Lockheed was getting ready to fly its U-2. So that's why this didn't go anywhere. Now, people, when they developed the U-2, knew it had a limited shelf life. They figured they could do overflights of the Soviet Union no later than 1960. Boy, did they get that right. But Northrop and the Air Force were looking at even higher flyers, so they come up with the N-204. And look at the size of that, 273-foot wing, a tail dragger. It looks like one of those, balsa wood flyers that you would launch, but it was a mammoth thing. So those are just some of the ideas that they were toying around with for LO, and then they go into space ideas. Well, utilizing the concept that Sanger had of the skip bomber, how about if we do some boost glide skip reconnaissance? So the N-173 was phase 3 of the Weapons System 118P proposal. And then the N-206 was part of the dinosaur proposal with dynamic soaring, not the old beast that died out. Well, maybe it's the same thing. But the dynamic soaring high altitude reconnaissance program, both Air Force programs to essentially fly high over the enemy, skip along the atmosphere, and re-enter and recover at a friendly base. Other interesting reconnaissance systems, a reconnaissance snark, unmanned. So they were looking at unmanned reconnaissance systems back in the early 1950s. You remember that? I don't know if you here and saw the slide I showed. There was an unmanned interceptor that Northrop was toying around with in 1953. So UAVs are not a new idea. Boundary layer control, a heavy thing that Northrop was involved with to increase the range of aircraft by various methods of suction along the wing or aerodynamic shaping. This was a reconnaissance version, a huge system. Obviously, it didn't go anywhere, but it was, again, some of the ideas that Northrop was toying around with. On a more tactical level, the N-180 was for the OV-1 competition, eventually won by the Mohawk, but you can see what Northrop's proposal looked like. And then you had the COIN, counterinsurgency, won by North American with its OV-10 Bronco, but Northrop had a few entries. This was the only one of the several entries that I saw that actually looked like it fit the proposal. The rest of them were turbojet powered in different configuration, but this particular one here, it was initially a Marine Corps pushed drive light armed reconnaissance aircraft, which became COIN. So it's very similar design. It made a very pretty airplane. Of course, you can always put reconnaissance systems on your existing aircraft, and there you go, the N-156, the F-5 getting the nose, and then the F-5E on the lower right. The RF-5A, that nose is supposed to be interchangeable with the regular nose, and it was only supposed to take 1 hour. And the reports were, no, a lot longer. Advanced F-5 concepts. This was a RF-5E with a gimbaled payload underneath the aircraft. That resurfaces on a proposed RF-20, as you can see on the lower right. Of course, the ultimate in surveillance, Tacit Blue. This was the airplane that would change everything for Northrop. As important as the N-156 was to the company, Tacit Blue was just as important, if not more so, because it ensured the company's survival to today. Without those LO programs, Northrop would have disappeared a long time ago. This was originally to fly along the forward edge of the battle area, FIBA, and to look unseen by the enemy behind enemy lines and track enemy armor, and to direct Army fire and Air Force and Navy strike aircraft to kill those threats. The radar system eventually migrated to the J-stars. Tacit Blue was not needed, but the technologies that were pioneered for that airplane showed up in just about everything since that we did. Continuing on with the space theme, 1957, 58, Sputnik goes up in 57, the world goes crazy over here, and so we start looking at a manned space program. Northrop proposes a BROOM, ballistic reentry of orbiting man, as one of many contractor concepts. And then, of course, the N-227 for Project Mercury. This was our proposal, had an 80-inch diameter base, which was larger than what McDonnell did for their capsule. And you can see how they proposed to fit it on the Redstone and on the Atlas by the model pictures below. Lifting body research, very heavily into that. M2F2 and the HL-10. Northrop was essentially hired guns for that. NASA design centers came up with the basic designs, and Northrop built to spec. But Northrop took that technology and looked at further designs for it. That included HILEAP, which was Hypersonic Lifting Entry Aerospace Program, and SLOMAR, Space Logistics Maintenance and Repair. Why were they looking at that? Because the Air Force was going to build space stations and they needed to be maintained. So that's why these programs were heavily in development in the mid-60s. Obviously that didn't come about. All right, let's look at some very unusual designs because they're cool. The N5 was probably inspired by a NACA project, which was backed by the Army Air Corps. Late 1959, there was one other company that developed a similar design. That was the Douglas with the DS-312A. They eventually went with a more conventional proposal, but this canard and pusher aircraft design was something that was seriously looked at. And of course, the R-40 competition, which resulted in the XP-54, 5, and 6, one of which was the Northrop Black Bullet, was the result of this interest in pusher technology. The Navy was also interested, which developed into the N6. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Northrop logbook, N6 is for the ZAP flap. developed by George Zapp. It was a special system of flaps to increase the wing area, so for slower landings and takeoffs. This design was also pushed, had the N6 designation. I suspect they were going to incorporate Zapp flaps onto the design, but it was primarily a pusher design, one with a high wing, one with a mid wing, and then there was this design, the mid-propeller design. A friend of mine calls it the buzzsaw proposal. Needless to say, that didn't get very far. It does put to lie the charge that Northrop refused to do any Navy projects after we were pulled from the SBD licensing. There was a story that Jack Northrop got up and told the Admiral, we will never ever bid on another Navy program. Well, in the first place, that was pre-war. In the second place, that was in the heat of the moment. And in the third place, once you go to war, you start designing no matter who the customer is. So there were a lot of Navy proposals that Northrop did during the war and the post-war years. I don't know what to say about that other than, wow, a twin Scorpion. How could you not like that? Technology options for alternative takeoff and landing study. This was just 3 of the several projects that they looked at. You can see that Bud Nelson's concepts influenced some of it, with the P900 series up there, with the hinged cockpit, which was a VSTOL idea that migrated over to this. But then you look and see some of the air cushion one is very much a Northrop-inspired design, which would use inflatable air cushions to land. How it managed to retract them is beyond me. I didn't get that far in the proposal. Heinz Gerhardt comes to the fore again with a new wing program, natural laminar flow wing, and it was also called the reverse delta. This was a proposal for a high-speed supersonic transport. This would have been 314 feet long if it was built. Yeah, not small. XST, experimental survivable test bed. This was the program that allowed us to compete for Tacit Blue. We had gotten into LO early on. In fact, the N204, that mammoth tail-sitter reconnaissance aircraft, that is the first mention that I have found in a Northrop document that mentions low observables. So they were thinking about it back in the 1950s. Of course, so was Lockheed with the SR-71. So in the early 1970s, when DARPA comes up with this experimental survivable test bed, this is Northrop's entry. Now, it didn't win, but it won enough goodwill from DARPA and the Air Force and the powers that be in the Pentagon that they said, we want Northrop to compete in future LO studies and competitions. And that led to Tacit Blue. Finally, I'm going to close with what I think is probably the most bizarre Northrop design. The truck, airplane, boat, verticraft, trifibian, early 1965. It flies, it floats, and it goes by, off-road. Why was this developed? It was an advanced research project agency, Project Agile, for U.S. Army resupply of remote and inaccessible outposts, read Vietnam. And that was about the time that the Army was told to get out of the fixed-wing transports and into helicopters, and that idea died. And that's my program. Thank you very much. Okay, so I will entertain some questions for as long as we have time. Which one was the Tiger Shark? That was the F-20. Why did I leave the B-2 out? I did the B-2 last program. The question was, there were 3 F-20 prototypes, 2 went down. Where's the third one? The third one is at the Exposition Park Museum. Yeah. It was here for a while they were doing earthquake refurbishment of the museum. And in fact, I had the good fortune of getting a family portrait. I managed, this is when the museum was over at Hawthorne, and a couple of buddies and I, with the permission of the Northrop hangar folks, got on the top level of the hangar, shot down, had the F-5A from Norway, the F-20, YF-17, YF-23. I love that photo. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming, and that's my program. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.